I totally lost focus. I want to say thank you for the organizers in letting me come here. It's been really interesting, and I met quite a few people that I really like to discuss more about your work and know more about what happens. It has also been really interesting to be in a country where I don't understand everything that's said. And it's not very easy, so we try to focus, but it's tricky. So when I do my research, I use event-related potentials, and in the end of my talk, I will actually show you how I do with that, so you don't have to worry if you don't know exactly how it functions right now. But I will talk today about what we can learn from studying language processing, sort of with the brain measures. But first, I want to show you this image here. So as you see here on the y-axis, we have second language proficiency, and on the x-axis, we have over time. And I divided now one group into adults. We have older children, maybe 6 and 7-year-olds, and then younger children, like the 1 to 3-year-olds, they're very young children. And now I want to ask you, how many of you think that adults are the ones that learn a new language fastest? Can you raise your hand? No. Okay. How many think that the older children are the ones that learn a new language fastest? Raise your hand. And how many think it's the youngest children? Okay. And everyone that didn't raise your hand, can you raise your hand? Okay, so let's see what research shows. So exactly opposite of what you believe, right? Because we as adults, we're really good at focusing. If I want to teach you Swedish, that would be faster than trying to teach a 1-year-old. Because you go, okay, I'm going to try this. And they focus. The 1-year-old go, yeah, whatever. And they're off. But also, that you already have sort of a word for, or the concept of computer, for instance. So if I tell you that in Swedish, that's dator, then you go, okay. Because you know the concept, you just get a new label for it, right? If you say that you like abstract concept, like scared, being scared, you have that concept and you know what it means. So if I say in Swedish it's rädd, you go, okay, then you can acquire that. You also know that in your first language you can talk about the future and the past. So if I tell you that in Swedish we do it this way, we say ska äta. Okay. And if we have done it in the past, we put on de. So springde. And you will go, okay. So it's really quick for you to learn. But the small child will get better than you in the end. Now, as you see here, it just is time. It doesn't say when the child becomes better than the adults. You could think that that's because I'm lazy or sort of that I didn't remember. But it's because this happens at different times depending on what aspect of the language that we're talking about. If we talk about perceiving and pronouncing speech sounds, then the little child is better than an adult. If they get exactly the same input, they're better in a couple of months, like 1 or 2 months, they're already better. If we look at syntax, how you put a sentence together, then they're better than the adult after maybe a couple of years. But if we look at the vocabulary, then we're better all the time. Because we already know concepts. Every day when we meet, at this meeting I have learned new concepts. You do that throughout life. But it's also that what we're really good at is this explicit learning. When someone tells us, oh, this is the way it works, then we go, okay, I can do this. We're really good at that. implicit learning, when you just get the feeling of how it works, that the small children are better at. And it might be that the brain plasticity is sensitive to that type of learning. But we do both, right? So when you learned, do you have driver license? You can drive a car? So if I ask you, when you turn to the left, will you put down the foot on the clutch first? Will you turn this, so the indicator first? Or will you look in the mirror first? Or will you sort of put your hand on, which one do you do first? Do you know? You don't. But you learned explicitly because your parents didn't say, here's the car keys, go out and feel how it works. Because that takes so long time. That's why they're so slow, those little ones. But by training, in the end, it becomes implicit. You don't think about how you drive the car anymore. I have lived abroad, so I've trained my English. I don't think about I don't have to translate from Swedish to English anymore. It sort of goes by itself. It's automatized. So it's neither nor, or it's both. It's just that we're better with the explicit, they're better with the implicit. So if we look at these different portions of the language, then one of the things is that we're going to talk about today is phonological awareness. So it's awareness of the sound systems. So to sort of, in Swedish, for instance, these images would be bar, and this would be par. The only thing that differ those two sounds, bar and par, is it's done in the same place, and it's just when you start sort of voicing or vibrating your vocal cords, or how sort of soft your lips are. But if you don't perceive that difference, you won't perceive those two different words. So babies and children that are really good at perceiving the speech sounds of their native tongue, that's sort of a really strong predictor. You don't hear?
No.
Hello.
It's because of the recording.
Yeah, but then I will just whisper. Hey, it's a homeless. Okay. So, yeah.
Where were you?
Yeah, exactly. And this is sort of how do I gesture with this here.
You can see.
It won't work. I will have to put it in the middle, and they will be fine. And otherwise, yeah, we can put it there because it won't. It's not. You all know that it's impossible to speak without using your hands, right?
Yes.
There you go.
I understand.
Italians don't gesture more.
Yes.
They just space. Swedes gesture here. Right. So what we know is that infants are really good with their own speech sounds, the native speech sounds. That predicts their vocabulary acquisition later on. So children that are bad with sort of noticing the speech sounds in their native tongue, they will have more difficulties acquire vocabulary. But it's a correlation, which means that by acquiring a second language or acquiring a language and these words, then you will understand that, oh, this is sort of an important distinction. If you're, I don't know Portuguese, but in Spanish, the cannot be in the beginning of the word. You can't say var, then it sounds bar. Do you know Spanish? Yes? Yeah. So a Spanish child and a Spanish adult won't hear the difference between var and var, because it's not important in their language. So that's good in Spanish. But if you would, as a Spanish speaker, come to Sweden, you would have to acquire that distinction between var and var. And you can do that by acquiring the words, and you see, oh, when they say var, it means to be. But bar, now they say it again, but now we're in the pub. And then so by acquiring these two different words and understanding that they mean something differently, you can learn to focus on that sound. But that also, what we've seen from studies of bilingual children is that by acquiring a second language, they are equally good at rhyming, for instance, all those phonological awareness tasks, as if they were compared to children that are monolingual. And some children are even better because they have more minimal pairs, more of these words that differ just with one speech sound. So we know from behavioral studies, that if you're bilingual, you're equally good or better at phonological awareness, which is good because literacy is sort of phonological awareness predicts your literacy skills. So a bilingual child probably has better sort of foundation for good literacy skills compared to a monolingual child. So moving to vocabulary, so this would be me. When I talk about cooking, if I would try to do that, I would do that with the Swedish vocabulary. But when I talk about science, then I'd rather do that in English. Because all the articles that I read, they're in English. If I have to give a lecture in Swedish, I have to translate from English. And it's sort of tricky to go, oh right, what's that in Swedish? Because that's not, I don't have that vocabulary in Swedish. And probably some of you have the same problem, right? And that's the same also for the children that are bilingual. That they know what they know from home in their first language. Everything at daycare, at the early childhood center, or at school, they only know then in the second language. That means that they can't come home and say, do you know what we did at daycare today? Because they don't know how to say that in the language that the parents know. It also means that they're not, sorry, but it also means that they don't have the vocabulary, but it's also that they learn to play only in their second language. They don't know how to play in the mother tongue. I knew that when I was working as an early childhood teacher, but when I had my two children, I had them when we lived in the States, so they learned to play only in English. And when they played in English, it broke my heart. But I knew what they said because I'm fluent in English. But I also realized that if I come from another culture, I come from Syria, I'm a refugee, I'm there for my children, I moved from my family and from my country to save my children. And then they play, and I don't know what they're talking about, and I don't understand it. It's really hard. But it also means that when we test children on their language proficiency in their second language, so if we take regular behavioral tests like SELF or PPDT, which is sort of measuring their receptive language, what they understand, their expressive language, what they can talk about, and their receptive vocabulary, the vocabulary items that they understand. Then for a monolingual child, we begin with the really early acquired words, and then it becomes more and more difficult. So it's a linear progression. But if we look at the bilinguals that have to do the same test, then it's first those words that they don't have in the second language. So it's really difficult words. And then it becomes words that they learn at the daycare center, and then it becomes so more difficult again. So it's U-shaped instead. Which means that when we test our bilingual children, they often come out as being worse in the second language than they actually are. You can come in. Oh yes! So first of all, they sort of do worse on the test because it's this U-shaped curve, but also because they're often not hasn't practiced doing that type of tests as often as the monolingual population. So when I did studies in the US, the American children had done similar stuff with their parents and played different types of games. So they've done this quite a lot. Whereas the sort of refugees and people moving to the country, they hadn't. So bilingual children often do poor on these tests just because they're not used to a test situation. So if you have open questions and you have a conversation, they often do better. So they're not fair, those tests. And if we look at syntax, so even if there's a large variability between children, between each individual, and depending on age, we see overall that about after roughly 3 years of exposure, they understand how to make sentences, the syntax, how you build the sentences. And see, so now I will start talking about the studies that I've done in the US. So in the US, roughly 20% of children in school are bilingual. If we look at the daycare centers, sort of at the age 0 to 5, it's more. It's 23 or 24%. That's similar to Sweden. We also have roughly 20% or more that are bilingual. And here too? Or, yeah, maybe you don't know. So, this is how we do identify potentials. So the child would come in and watch a screen, and in this example, the child would look at, I will show you the movie soon, but they will look at 2 images that pronounce different words that are rhyming or not rhyming. For this experiment, we use pseudo words. Pseudo words are made up words that they don't exist, but they could exist because they're pronounceable in the language. And it's good to use the pseudo words because then the monolingual won't have any benefits because they already know cat, hat, pat, bat, and so on. So the bilinguals and monolinguals, neither of them have ever heard these words before. So they can just focus on if these word pairs rhyme or not. So we listen into the brain, just like when you listen to the heart, to the stethoscope, you know how you amplify to be able to hear. Now what we do is listen to the neurons when they talk and interact with each other with electricity. And then we take that signal and amplify it, and we get the electroencephalogram, the EEG. What's nice about it is that electricity moves with the speed of light. So we measure here on the brain, on top of the brain, when it actually happens in the brain as they process. Much different from a language test where we ask them something. Can you point to the picture where the boy is pushing the girl? And then they point. It takes them maybe 5 seconds or something. Whereas we do it millisecond by millisecond as sort of they process the language. So we have that continuous signal, and then we have a speaker here, and they hear maybe dat, kom, blij, cry. And then we have this continuous EEG where a lot of stuff is going on in the brain. And we cut out different parts of that because there's a lot. You think about it, a lot of other things at the same time, right? So we want to know how the brain reacts only to these words that don't rhyme with the word that were presented before, and we cut out those pieces of the electroencephalogram, of the EEG. And we cut out every time the word rhymed, and we cut out those parts too. So this here is exactly when the word was presented, when it started. So now I'm going to show you what we do with it later. So on this graph here you have microvolts. It has minus on the top and plus below because that's how they did it before, because it's a medical measurement. It has nothing to do with if it's good or bad. The reason for it to be negative or positive is because in your cortex you have the cells, they line up like this. So if you have cells that are lined up like this, positive and negative, and they send the signal, it would be positive over these electrodes and it would be negative over these electrodes. But if the cortex is folded, then it would be upside down, right? So then it would be negative and positive. So it depends on measures like that. So it has nothing to do with whether it's good or bad. But what we know is that if we have the same distribution of that positivity or the negativity over these electrodes, then we know that it's sort of, if you show the same pattern as you show, then we know that you use the same neurons to process this thing, okay? I don't think maybe that was confusing. It might be easier in a while. But you see here, this is when we present the word at 0. So blind, right, they're roughly 300 milliseconds long. And this is sort of 1,000 milliseconds, so only 1 second. So we make an average of brain activity at the presentation of rhyming pseudowords, and then not much happens in the brain. So we cancel out all that noise, and only sort of what happens in the brain when they process that word shows up. So what happens then when we do the same to the non-rhyming pseudowords? Ta-da! Then we get an effect that we call the rhyming effect. So then we can look at this effect and see when it starts, and we can see the difference between these two. That's called the rhyming effect. And then we can compare this with different groups and see how does their brain process and how do their brain process this. So what happens then? Yeah, if we look at 3 to 5-year-olds that have English as a first language, then, now I don't usually shave the heads of the kids. This is just an image. So if I look at this electrode here, you can see that there is a huge effect. And even if they on tests are worse than adults, they're not as good at knowing if the words rhyme or not, and if they would press a button, they would be much slower than adults. These 3 to 5-year-olds, their brain processes rhyming as quickly as adults. Nice. So I told you before that we expect 6 to 8-year-old bilinguals. They do better or as good as monolinguals in phonological awareness. So if we look at, semantic ERP effects on sort of the vocabulary, if we look at adults, we can see that they then get an N400 effect. It's called N400 because it's a negativity that peaks around 400 milliseconds after they heard the word. Then adults N400 will start earlier than older children that will start earlier than younger children. Just saying that it's sort of proficiency, how good you are in the language, that will affect this. And when they do studies on adults, monolinguals, and bilinguals first language, L1, and bilingual second language, L2, we see similar pattern showing it has to be proficiency and also your vocabulary size, right? Because a monolingual and a bilingual first language, they acquired it at the same age. So it's not an age of acquisition effect. So from adult research, we know that the brain processes the meaning of the word, the semantics. Similarly, it's just sort of a difference of maybe 30 milliseconds how quick you process this, depending on how many languages you have. So when we do this study with children, we let them watch a movie, Pingu, and listen to synthesis. Right. So when we look at these, I will show you different waves instead. So I take this here for she claps her ball happily, instead of she claps her hands happily, and then I get a different wave. And by using that sort of difference, so I can see what are the effects, then I can compare two groups, right? Because I can plot them on the same side. I will show you. If we look at sort of syntax, when you have these sentences and how you build the sentences, it's a bit more complicated. If we look at adult monolinguals, they have a left anterior negativity, alarm, and that is over here, and it becomes more focal with proficiency. Because if you're good at something, you don't have to spend, you use a very specialized part of the brain for processing that. But you also get a P600, and in this case, it has stronger amplitude and is more widely distributed with proficiency. If we look at adult bilinguals, they either don't have this LAM, this left anterior negativity, or it might be over the right hemisphere. So they use another part of the brain to sort of process syntax. And the P600 might be later and smaller. And then we have senior monolingual children. Prior research has shown that they can show the LAM and the P600 if the sentences are very, very easy and not that very complex. So what have we learned from studying children's brains while they process language? Yeah, I think we have two major things that I've learned. One is that groups that differ in age of acquisition and SES process language differently, but mainly in relation to language proficiency. And that the largest differences between these monolingual and bilingual children, they were found in phonological processing. So by that, I would like to thank my collaborators and invite you to have a look at this sort of conference on communication and cognition and learning in Lund. And thank you. Thank you.